We left off on the Black Halo, where I mentioned a whole lot changed for Kamelot visually. But before I delve into it, I will recap a few important points made in the prequel video. We focused on the female figure. We looked at the female nude throughout the history of European art, and saw that many elements present in the early album covers of Kamelot resemble the art historical tradition of the female nude, oftentimes represented as the mythical figure Venus. We paid particular attention to the nudity, the pose, the gaze, and the distance between female figure and male observer, and discussed how each of those things has an effect on the observer, who is presumed male. The covers we looked at were the Fourth Legacy, Karma, and Epica. We were able to identify that throughout those covers, the nudity, pose, gaze, and distance went through slight changes. At the end of the first video, I briefly introduced the album The Black Halo, saying that here, for the first time, we can see some significant changes in the presentation of the female figure. Now, we're ready to pick up where we left off. Let's take a moment to understand the narrative that starts with Epica and ends with the Black Halo. If you're already familiar with the narrative of the albums, skip to this time over here. The story takes place at an unknown time and place on Earth. God has commanded all angels to serve alongside humans on the Earth, but one angel named Mephisto has refused to obey this order, claiming that he takes orders from God alone. For this, Mephisto is expelled from heaven. God eventually decides to give Mephisto one chance. If Mephisto can claim the soul of God's favorite man, an alchemist and scholar named Ariel, then can he return to heaven. If not, then Mephisto will be condemned to hell forever. Mephisto agrees and searches for Ariel. Meanwhile, Ariel is introduced, and he begins to ponder his research on the true meaning of life and why God created humans. He concludes that neither science nor religion can truly answer these questions. Feeling restless, he decides to go on a quest to search for answers. He bids his farewell to everyone, including his lover Helena, as he departs, vowing never to return. Years pass as Ariel searches. He becomes addicted to drugs, and eventually turns to the occult, during which he sees a brief vision of Mephisto. He begins to think of Helena, whom he misses greatly, while aimlessly walking through the wilderness, regretting his decision to leave. He gives up his search and decides to commit suicide, believing that he will never find the answers he is looking for. But before Ariel has the chance, Mephisto shows himself to Ariel and proposes a deal. Mephisto will help Ariel in his search for the questions and fulfill all his worldly desires. In return, Mephisto will claim Ariel's soul when he dies. In Mephisto's castle, the fallen angel throws a feast in his honor. At the feast, Ariel agrees to Mephisto's contract, but with one modification. Mephisto can only claim Ariel's soul if Ariel experiences joy so sublime that he wishes to live forever in that moment. Mephisto begrudgingly accepts this deal. After leaving Mephisto's castle, Ariel is found by Helena, who has been searching for him over the years since he left. Ariel is shocked and overjoyed. Ariel and Helena sleep together, and without them realizing it, a child is conceived. After spending some time with Helena, Ariel decides to leave and continue his search for the truth. With the newfound power that Mephisto has provided him, he feels that the answers are within his grasp. Ariel tells Helena of his intent to go, saying that while he loves her, love means nothing to me if there is a higher place to be. After Ariel leaves, Helena is heartbroken and vowing that she will continue to love Ariel even in death, drowns herself in a river, also unknowingly killing her unborn child. After learning of Helena's suicide and pregnancy, Ariel becomes increasingly upset and weeps at the river where Helena died. Consumed with grief, Ariel questions whether he should continue his quest. In Ariel's weakened state, Mephisto's influence over him grows, and he agrees to continue his quest, while Helena watches him from heaven. Here, the Epica part of the story ends. At the beginning of the Black Halo, Ariel is still stricken with grief and sorrow over Helena's death. With Ariel's will nearly under Mephisto's total control, the fallen angel brings Ariel a beautiful young woman named Marguerite, who looks and speaks like Helena. Ariel seduces Marguerite, and the two sleep together, which completes Mephisto's manipulation of Ariel. The morning after, Ariel regains his memory, breaking Mephisto's control over him, and comes to his senses. He apologizes to Marguerite and explains his story, begging her to leave, but saying that they might meet again someday. Ariel begins to reflect on how all the pain he has caused could come about as a result of his good intentions in searching for the answers to the meaning of life. He concludes that it is impossible to find these answers on earth and that they must lie in heaven alone. Realizing that his sins have prevented him from entering heaven, he begs God for forgiveness, but hears no sign from him. Heartbroken, he realizes that he will never be able to reunite with Helena, nor find the answers he seeks. He looks back on the suffering that he has caused to everyone he knows and concludes that it can never be undone. With this, Ariel prompts himself into action and decides to confront Mephisto. Resigning himself to death, he approaches Mephisto. Ariel denounces him as traitorous and evil. He cuts his ties to Mephisto and resolves to live a good life, even though his sins have damned his soul to hell anyway. Eventually, Ariel realizes that love is the ultimate answer to life, and that the true love between himself and Helena was thus a part of it. He knows now that even having found his answer, he will never be truly satisfied, and that his free will allows him to create his own meaning of life and his own destiny. With his questions finally answered, he comes to a state of transcendental understanding and sublime joy, so strong that he wishes to linger at that moment forever. This moment of total satisfaction brings into effect the contract that Ariel made with Mephisto, and thus his soul now belongs to the fallen angel. As Ariel's soul begins to leave his body, Mephisto prepares to claim it. However, Helena intercedes to God on Ariel's behalf. Since Ariel has rejected all evil, even in the face of damnation, he has redeemed himself, and God allows him to enter heaven with Helena. Mephisto, his bet with God lost, wails as he is cast into hell forever. With the story over, it is revealed that Ariel's tale is a playset for a New Year's Eve festival, similar to the framing device of Goethe's Faust. Helena's death is a turning point in the narrative that defines much of what comes after. In many songs from the Black Halo, Ariel talks about the river as a trigger to his trauma, the suicide of his loved one and their unborn child. In the lyrics of Abandon, he asks God to help him cross the river in his journey, and he says in Moonlight that the sound of the river cuts the silence like a knife. On the cover of the Black Halo, a woman's face is half submerged in water. It's Helena, frozen in the moment she drowns in the river and changes the course of Ariel's life. What are the important elements to notice here, especially in connection with the covers we looked at before? First of all, for the first time, the woman is looking straight at you, unapologetically exerting agency over the observer. Her eyes say, "You are looking at me, but I am also looking at you. So your power over me is limited." The male gaze, which we talked about in the first video, is defied here by the confrontation of the woman's own gaze. Again, this is the very first time the woman on the cover of a Kamelot album has her face and eyes turned straight towards the viewer, despite being sideways. She is also closer to the observer than ever before. This increased proximity allows for her entire face to be rendered in so much more detail and, as we have discussed before, grants her more individuality. The closeness also invades more of the personal space of the observer, which in the cover of The Fourth Legacy, for example, was preserved for the comfort of the male viewer. The further you are from the object you observe, the safer you feel to look at it without being noticed or caught in the act. Both her closeness and her straight pose and gaze are in accordance with the narrative. When Ariel left Helena, they were far away from each other because Ariel left on his lone journey. And when Helena dies, she goes theoretically even further from him, somewhere he could not possibly reach her if he wanted to. But her death actually brings her closer to him because after dying, Helena will be ever present in Ariel's life as a haunting trauma that follows him in every turn he takes and every sin he commits. The sound of the river will forever bring her to his memory and cause him suffering and guilt. So her proximity to the observer alludes to a close presence that, in the story, is not a physical one, but a spiritual, psychological one. Although the scene depicted on the cover happened with Helena's physical body, there is reason to understand the scene we are looking at, not as the actual event that took place at the moment it did, but a psychological reenactment of it, therefore showing Helena less as a vulnerable, dying woman and more as a phantasmagorical memory with an accusatory gaze inflicting guilt onto Ariel. So, not only her gaze is now directed very pointedly at the observer, It is an accusatory gaze that exerts more power over the observer, similarly to how it exerts power over the psyche of the main character of the narrative, who, let's not forget, is a man. There is another important way in which the depiction of this woman is different from the previous ones. Where is her body? The woman shown here is only a face. You can barely see her hair, and you most definitely cannot see her neck. The female figure then not only has her body hidden from the male gaze, but if we interpret her as the phantasmagorical memory, her very presence is dematerialized, hence rendered inaccessible to the viewer, as to Ariel. Other elements in the cover add to those that come directly from this female figure. One of them is a stark difference in color palette when compared to the previous albums. All of them before, including the ones that did not have a woman or any human present, had predominantly purple hues. With the Black Halo, red takes over the image, surrounding the space around the woman's face and also coloring her lips. This change from purple hues to red also has the effect of making the cover of the Black Halo warmer, yet simultaneously more aggressive. Red alludes to passion and violence, two concepts personified in Helena through her love for Ariel and her violent death by suicide. Now, a picture of a woman drowning in a river. Has anyone ever seen this painting before? This is the drowning Ophelia from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Picking flowers, she slips and falls into a stream. Mad with grief after her father's murder by Hamlet, her lover, she allows herself to die. The flowers she holds are symbolic. The poppy means death, daisies innocence, and pansies love in vain. These themes sound familiar, right? The artist is John Everett Millais, a Pre-Raphaelite. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood looked back at the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, before Raphael, for a beauty and spirituality that they found lacking in their own time. Millais' painting La Pia de Tolomei illustrates a scene from Dante's Purgatory, in which La Pia, the pious one, wrongly accused of infidelity and locked up by her husband, is dying. The rosary and prayer book at her side refer to her piety, while the sundial and ravens suggest the passage of time and her impending death. Her continuing love for her husband is represented by his letters, which lie under her prayer book. The luxuriant fig leaves that surround her are traditionally associated with shame, and they seem to suck her into themselves. Isn't all of this familiar as well? This work by Dante Gabriel Rossetti is a representation of Mariana from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure and Tennyson's poem Mariana in the Moated Grange. Her expression and dejected posture convey frustrated desire and weary resignation. She waits unhappily for a tarrying fiancé. Familiar again? The main themes of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were initially religious, but they also used subjects from literature and poetry, particularly those dealing with love and death. We know that Epica and the Black Halo are also based on a work of literature, Faust, and love and death are likely the most suitable words to summarize Helena in the story. Helena, who at the end of the story helps Ariel be allowed into heaven, is a typical tragic heroine, like Shakespeare's Ophelia. But here's a twist. When I was analyzing this album cover in preparation for this video, my husband pointed out that he thought the woman on the cover of the Black Halo was Mephisto, not Helena. And I had to stop for a second and try to understand why he thought so. A few possibilities are the defiant, confident gaze, the strong presence of red as a signifier of violence or evil, and the somewhat sexualized nature of the makeup she's wearing. That's right, in this picture the woman is close enough for the artist to enhance her face with makeup-like characteristics. She wears red lipstick, a contour line above her jaw, very manicured arched eyebrows, and cat eye-like eyeshadow application. It seems like the artist Derek Gores knows his makeup. These makeup elements are usually the ones you find in YouTube tutorials on how to achieve a femme fatale look. In Victorian England, the ideal of womanhood was still inspired by that of domesticity and chastity, but the roles of women were changing during the Victorian era, and a growing proto-feminist sentiment was arising as a result. New femininities were being proposed by women themselves through social activism and by artists in their depiction of female behavior. The Pre-Raphaelites were partial to the new proposed womanhood of the time, and oftentimes this manifested in their art through the archetype of the femme fatale. Let's break down what the archetype of the femme fatale means. An archetype is the original pattern or model from which all things of the same kind are copied or on which they are based. A model or first form, prototype, or in Jungian psychology, a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, image, etc., universally present in individual psyches. Examples of archetypes are the hero, the rebel, or the explorer. A femme fatale is an attractive and seductive woman, especially one who is likely to cause risk to or the downfall of anyone who becomes involved with her. Examples of femme fatales are Catwoman, Cersei Lannister, and Britney Spears in the video for Toxic. The term femme fatale is usually more associated with film and photography nowadays, but it has been used in England since the late 1800s. Interestingly, the term femme fatale was used by Kamelot's ex-vocalist Roy Khan to describe singer Simone Simmons, who is a guest in the album singing in the track The Haunting. In the video for the song, Simone, who is known for her trademark red hair, is shown wearing 3 different outfits, one of which is kind of the metal version of Britney Spears' Oops, I Did It Again red latex overalls, and rocking stunning lipstick and eyeshadow, both in a purplish shade of red. Her makeup can be seen in several close-ups during the video and is very saturated, especially against the white background where she wears the red outfit and makeup. Thomas's wife, Mary Youngblood, who also appears in the video, is shown most remarkably surrounded in red drapery, albeit nude, wearing, guess what? Red eyeshadow. Of course, this is a deviation from the album cover, but one I thought was worth bringing in, even if briefly, into the discussion on the color red and the concept of the femme fatale, which is also a recurring motif in the Pre-Raphaelites brotherhood. The femme fatale archetype is by no means an invention of Victorian society or the Pre-Raphaelites themselves. It has been present in the visual arts across the globe throughout the centuries, as well as in myth and literature, likewise widespread. But the Pre-Raphaelites did demonstrate a focus on the trope of the femme fatale, and recent art historical discourses even highlight the relative bigger participation of women in the Pre-Raphaelites brotherhood art production relative to previous art historical moments. One writer argues that the works of what has been called the Pre-Raphaelite sisterhood display a greater melancholy and not an assertive sensuality, as did those of their male counterparts, thus moving to the female gaze. What this author means is that the women artists' depiction of the femme fatale, or of women in general, was more sympathetic to a female observer than were the ones crafted for the male gaze instead. That is a very interesting point because it touches on the issue of the male gaze we have been talking about, and how the male gaze is being challenged on the cover of the Black Halo. I find this a very compelling connection between the Black Halo and the Pre-Raphaelites. But could we read those female figures from before as femme fatales by any chance? We looked at them before from the very specific perspective of pose, gaze, nudity, and the relative distance between them and the viewer. According to those criteria, yes, they do conform with some key characteristics of the Venus and the female nudes that sought to promote chastity and domesticity. But what if I tell you that the Lady of the Lake can indeed also be seen as a femme fatale? She actually appears in Pre-Raphaelite art for that very reason. Although, as we have seen on The Fourth Legacy, she is highly objectified and kept at a safe distance from the male gaze, and looking away to allow for free contemplation, she is holding a sword, an instrument of power and death. And in terms of the narratives of Arthurian legend, she is powerful, deceitful, and mysterious. The particular sword she is holding is a destiny-defining sword that is at the center of the legend of King Arthur. Elizabeth Bathory, well, if she is not the most literal femme fatale, bathing in the blood of the fatalities she caused herself, according to lore, I don't know who would be. Helena definitely is not a femme fatale in the cover of Epica. Mephisto, in turn, shows signs of the femme fatale trope. The voluptuous, partly exposed body, the mask, which alludes to deceit, and beyond the visuals of the cover, we know she is a femme fatale in the narrative, while Helena is a victim of the abandonment of her love Ariel. So we can maybe lump the Lady of the Lake, Elizabeth Bathory, and Mephisto into the femme fatale category, but keep Helena, I mean the one from the cover of Epica, out of it. But in the cover of the Black Halo, Helena is merged with the femme fatale characteristics that we could attribute to Mephisto. If you think about it, Ariel is resentful of Helena for ending her own life with their child in her womb. He is also perpetually broken because of her decision. If you refer back to the definition of the term we looked at a moment ago, Mephisto has always been one, but Helena becomes one as she turns the tables on Ariel, abandoning him like he abandoned her before. The cover of the Black Halo may have been intended to depict Helena alone, with her half-submerged face working as an iconographical reference to the character, but she definitely looks different from the Helena we saw on the cover of Epica, dressed in white, releasing white doves in the air, with pure golden hair. Here, she comes along with death, guilt, and a defiant gaze. In other words, there's some Mephisto in her on the cover of the Black Halo, putting her into the universe of ambivalent representations of powerful women that define the archetype of the Femme Fatale. Recapping, we gradually transitioned from elements of the art historical Venus to more Femme Fatale elements, also seen in the history of art. If the Femme Fatale was present since the beginning of the Kamelot covers, it was perfected over time by shedding elements of the Venus that were also present in them, culminating in the cover of the Black Halo, the album that featured the metal Femme Fatale herself, Simone Simmons, in the words of Roy Kahn. The Black Halo shifted the paradigm of feminine representation seen in the band's previous album covers. This shift incorporates a more complex image of women. What is left for us is to wonder what this may mean for our implicit understanding of womanhood as consumers of heavy metal and heavy metal visual culture. What do you think? How do you feel when you look at these covers together so far? On the next video, we will tackle the rest of Kamelot's discography, from Ghost Opera through the Shadow Theory. It will be the third and final video of this series. So stay tuned and stay metal.